Hey people, I'm ZSH Plays. Welcome back to the Wetlands, Florida. As you've probably guessed from the intro, we are building an aviary today, and this is the first aviary that I've built in a very long time, so I am very excited to try and put this together. And the aviary that I'm building is based on a real aviary. It's called the Bois De La Bâtie. It's in a park in Geneva, but we're going to be changing it for our purposes, because it's going to be housing the new red-crowned cranes, which I'm really excited to add to the zoo. It's been a long time since we had a new bird that wasn't a penguin, so this is a really cool opportunity to build something for them, and I'm going to take full advantage of that. So what we're building is an aviary based on suspended mesh. So I'm putting the mesh pieces in here and then curving them out slightly at the bottom and attaching them to these squares of plaster at the top. Don't worry too much about the squares of plaster, they're just there so I've got something to hang the mesh of. They will all be covered up with the roof later on, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to choose this aviary to base the design on, because the red-crowned cranes live in pretty cold environments in Asia, mainly in northern Japan and I think northern China and parts of South Korea. So they are actually birds that like a cold climate, not particularly suited to the Everglades. But I looked at zoos around the world that held them, and I found a zoo in Greece that holds them. I've not been to Japan or South Korea, but I have been to Greece and I know how hot it gets there. So I figure if they're okay in a zoo in Greece, then they will be okay in a zoo in the Everglades. But I wanted an aviary with a roof so that they would get shade. So this aviary has a roof all the way across it, and then the mesh hangs down from there. And I've put the mesh in so that it is sort of sweeping out slightly towards the bottom, because that's how it is in the aviary that I'm basing this on. And that is a pretty common feature in aviaries, but it does make it really difficult to work with, because when you have it coming out further at the bottom than it does at the top, when you try and copy the pieces next to each other, you're going to end up with gaps. So you have to be really careful with how you place these as you put the shape together. You can see it's a really organic shape, which is another thing I really liked about this aviary. That's why the plaster pieces at the top don't align, but we're going to replace those now with a roof, which will cover those up completely and give us a nice sinuous shape to the roof. And like I say, also provide shade for the cranes. Inside the aviary, of course, we're going to have a lot of water, with it being the wetland zoo, and that is where the red-crowned cranes spend the majority of their time. So I'm using more plaster pieces here to create the roof and just sort of experimenting with the shape of it. It's not an exact replica of the Bois De La Bâtie, it's more an interpretation of it, I guess. The original aviary is split into two, and it's designed from what I can see of it. I've not been there myself, but from what I can see of it, for fairly small birds. I think they had some species of pigeon in there, I think, maybe some starlings and things like that. I think the biggest bird I saw in there was some sort of pheasant or peacock. So these cranes are pretty big by bird standards. So I've made the aviary a lot wider and kept it all as one aviary rather than splitting it into two, so that we get enough space for the birds. And by the way, thank you so much for your comments and likes on this series so far. I'm really glad that you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. It's really allowed me to sort of stretch out and do different things to what I normally do in Tecton Zoo. I'm trying to do something new in each episode, experimenting with different designs and a different aesthetic. I am really enjoying it. So thanks for watching, thanks for liking, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway, enough of that rhubarb, let's get back to this build. So I'm going to put in some guide ropes for the mesh, using the new European cable pieces, which are enormously useful. I'm a big fan of these pieces. I've started using them more and more, and they are perfect for making the guide ropes that are going to come down here, and then just playing around with various different little pieces from the Europe pack until I find something that looks a bit like it might attach a cable to the floor. Just a little detail that you probably won't even see when you're looking at the build, but I like to know that it's there. And I'll just copy this around to the rest of the aviary. It also helps cover up any tiny little gaps in the mesh at the bottom, because I wasn't able to eliminate those completely. And if you're wondering how the structure's going to stay up, because it kind of just looks like it's floating at the moment. In the center of it are these pillars, which are designed to look like sort of impressionistic trees, and they are what actually keeps the structure up, made of various different colors, various different shapes. They're not supposed to actually look like trees, they're supposed to resemble trees or call trees to mind, and they are a really attractive way of holding the structure up without impeding the view too much or getting in the way of the birds. While I finish that off, let's talk about the plans for the rest of the wetlands. So where we're building here is just after the Capybara walkthrough. So this is going to be the next habitat that the guests get to, and there's going to be paths that will take them to both sides of this aviary so they can see it from either side, and that will enable them to choose which part of the zoo to get to after the cranes as well. So opposite the cranes we're going to have a lot more staff buildings, I think, to get the rest of the infrastructure into the zoo that we need. And then after that we're going to have some really big hoofstock habitats, one for the new wild water buffalo and one for the Nile Lechwe. So looking forward to making those. That's another thing that I have not done very much of, is making habitats for hooved mammals. So that is going to be a lot of fun to work out how to do that. I want to get some really, really beautiful landscaping in there rather than this quite architectural stuff that we're doing here for the aviary. We're going to go the opposite and let nature do the work for us. By nature, of course, I mean me placing 1,000 trees and shrubs by hand. And as the path sweeps around there, I want to have a big flamingo lake as well. I did toy with the idea of having a massive aviary for the cranes and the flamingos, but as soon as I saw this design, I really wanted to put this into the zoo, and there was never going to be a way to adapt this to have both animals in. So I think a big traditional flamingo lake will sit really nicely next to these. And then after that, we're going to have an exhibit for the new Crested Newt. I've got a really cool idea for an exhibit build. If you watch my channel, you know I love an exhibit build, despite most people hating them. And I've got a really cool idea for trying to make an aquatic exhibit that looks a little different to how you normally see them in the game. So I'm excited to get into that. And then after that, there's going to be a huge walkthrough for American alligators. Can't build a zoo in the Everglades without alligators. And I originally designed something for the new spectacle Caiman, but I realized that it would work much better for the alligators. So I'm going to come up with a different, more intimate habitat for the Caimans because they're a bit smaller. And then finally, in my plans at the moment, although there's still a few other animals, I may try and get in here a habitat for the platypus. I am very excited about that. I actually don't have a design for that yet. I'm waiting for the for inspiration to strike, because that needs to be a really, really good habitat, because that is an animal I'm absolutely fascinated by. I've never seen a platypus. They're very rare outside of zoos in New Zealand, and I've never been to anywhere in Australasia actually, which is a shame. One day I really, really want to get to well, ideally New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, everywhere around there, but certainly at least one of those places. But yeah, as soon as I've got a design for the platypus, you will know about it. And that at the moment is the plans for the zoo. But if there are any other animals that you really want to see in here, let me know in the comments. And if we get a lot of votes for one particular animal that I've not considered, then maybe we can get that into the zoo as well. I always love hearing your ideas. It's great when you get other ideas that you haven't thought of that just given to you for free in the comments. So hit me up in the comments if there's anything else you want to see in here. Anyway, let's get back to this build. So I'm putting in the tree structures that I mentioned earlier here, which is going to keep this this roof where it should be. And I just love the modernist style support structures. These are copied almost exactly from the Bois De La Bâtie. Not quite. They have a lot of perching birds in that aviary, so there's a lot more branches on the trees, but these stalks aren't really big on perching, so I got rid of a lot of those and tried to make them a bit more solid looking and a bit more striking. Let's move on and get the paths in that I mentioned earlier. This is going to give the guests a choice of which way to go around the zoo. You don't want them all just going around one path all the way around the zoo. Obviously you're going to get congestion, etc. And then we'll move on to the final stage of the build, the inside of the habitat. I'm using the Flatten to Terrace tool. I finally understand what it does thanks to a tutorial from Rudi Rennkamel. So yeah, it is a bit counterintuitive, to be perfectly honest with you, but basically you have to sort of make a water body yourself, and then you can use the Flatten to Terrace brush to get it to a uniform size. And then finally, as I've done on the left here, you can use the offset to shallow pool option to slightly lower the terrain around the pool so that you get an area of really, really shallow water. I believe that is what the animals that can bathe are able to bathe in. Regardless, it just looks really cool. It's a great option once you get your head around it. So thanks to Rudi Rennkamel for his tutorial, because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing with that tool before that. And there we go. Water looks so much better with this tool. Gives you a lot more precision once you get used to it. Now we're going to move on to rocks and planting. You know I love my rocks, so I'm going to put an enormous rock in here and then mostly hide it in the terrain. So there's a sort of shelf out into the water, and then loads of small rocks here and there just to make things look a bit more interesting. I may have mentioned this before, but I am a huge fan of the rocks in this game. They're so well modelled and they can just completely transform anything you're building really just by placing these little guys around. So we're going to get a hell of a lot of these rocks in, along with a load more plants, especially sinking the really big rocks into the terrain so they sort of poke out in little places and then don't poke out in other places. Lets you get a really sort of rich look. And then the final build that we're going to do is just a tiny little shelter for the cranes. If they get too hot, this is going to go in the corner, maybe somewhere where they can nest as well. I'll put some coolers in it and a sleeping platform, and this can be their little base for when things get too hot. And then we've just got a little bit more planting and things like that to do. And this is one of my favourite parts of the build, when everything is coming together. We're going to put a few enrichment items in. I absolutely love the fact that you can recolour the feeder tray now. That's perfect, the way that just sits at the bottom of the water now. You barely even notice it's there. So we'll just get some really natural looking feeding from the birds in that part of it. And then you cannot do a build since the Europe pack without covering everything in periwinkle grass, of course, including Frontier, I noticed in the latest screenshots they shared for this pack. So yeah, this stuff is going to go absolutely everywhere because it just makes perfect grass, especially the way there's two different shades of it. Normally I use the sort of lighter green one, but for this Everglades Zoo I'm going with the richer, more vibrant green option. And then we're going to do something that you probably should do first, which is put the barriers in. I have to admit, I literally forgot to put barriers into this build until I got to this point. I was so concerned with my mesh, I forgot that that was just a construction piece and it wasn't actually a habitat. So we get that in, build a little shelter for the door for the keepers to access the habitat, which I'll mostly cover up later with some trees and some more periwinkle grass. And that is the build done. I really hope you enjoy it. I particularly like the cinematics at the end of this video. I've been using the new Explore cam to shoot them with and they look really good. Next week I'll be back with a new episode of Tecton Zoo at last, and I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.